This is Julia James Davis, and welcome to The War on Beauty. What does the Nazi view of beauty have to do with our present body positivity era, contemporary art, fashion, and architectural design? Well, actually, a lot more than you might think. Much of our present-day cultural discourse around beauty, from advertising to music to art to architecture, remains underpinned by this notion that traditional beauty is somehow fascist, while rejecting classical beauty represents freedom, progress, and liberation. I first encountered this perspective in my freshman year art history class. We were studying church architecture from early Christian to Gothic when somehow the conversation shifted to talking about Trump's revival of classical architecture for government buildings. And in my head, I was like, oh, I didn't hear about that. That's so cool. I think that's great. And then the students all of a sudden said, oh my gosh, Hitler did that. That's so fascist. And the professor agreed. They were like, yes. And I was like, in my head, I was like, what are they talking about? I have never heard this in my life. I was shocked. And this was my first introduction to the widespread notion in academia and in art that beauty was inherently suspicious, associated with oppression, Nazism, and backwards thinking. That beauty always serves those in power at the expense of the oppressed. The core argument stems from how the Nazis employed classical beauty to frame their Third Reich. They built government buildings in the neoclassical styles and publicly labeled modern art movements like Dadaism and Cubism as degenerate, while looting classical art treasures to build their Führer Museum. Beyond Nazi Germany, other fascist regimes like in Italy under Mussolini and in Spain under Franco, they similarly embraced classical aesthetics to shape public perception of their rule. That was basically the branding of their governments. And so these current historical connections have persisted, and the association of traditional beauty and classical beauty with authoritarian politics. And that connects to now when Trump does his executive order on making all new government buildings built in the classical architectural style, then that kind of further bolsters the media narrative that Trump is a tyrant and a fascist, which we see all the time. What's really interesting though is that this is nothing new because, like I said, this started after World War II. So after World War II, when the United States emerged as the undisputed victor, politically, militarily, artistically, financially, everything, America adopted an aesthetic directly contrary to Nazi Germany's. So while the Nazis labeled abstract artists as degenerate, America chose the abstract expressionist artists like Jackson Pollock and Mark Rothko. They were chosen to be this new American style. And government buildings, instead of being built in the classical style as they historically were in the United States, were instead constructed in the brutalist style. And there was also experimental forms of music being pushed. And we talk about this in some previous videos, which I'll link, about the CCF and how the CIA was involved in kind of astroturfing some interesting art movements. But basically, so after the war, this cemented the idea that traditional beauty belonged to the old world order that needed to be defeated for a more equitable and free future. So art and culture really became propaganda tools, that the freedom to create something unconventional or historically considered ugly by classical standards, it represented these new American values of individual expression and liberation. And so fast forward to today, we still see this aesthetic ideology permeating Western culture. Many aspects of contemporary art, architecture, music, fashion, everything actively reject traditionalism and transcendent beauty as a critique of what's perceived to be a regressive in equal past. So the Valley of the Fallen in Spain is a great example of this fascist classical architecture. This monument is at the center of an ongoing controversy. It was built by Francisco Franco as a monument to those who died in the Spanish Civil War. And this classical style monument features the world's tallest cross and a massive, beautiful Catholic basilica. Spain's socialist government attempted to desacralize the church and convert it to a secular museum dedicated to historical memory. And while the Benedictines who were there have successfully won their ability to stay at the basilica, and it will no longer be desacralized, this just shows how new governments with the socialist or kind of like progressive ideology aim to persecute the aesthetics associated with fascism. They want to get rid of places like this. So this perspective does create a very complex dynamic, which on the one hand, classical beauty has certainly been weaponized in the past by oppressive regimes, but on the other hand, the wholesale rejection of traditional beauty has created its own form of aesthetic dogma that sacrifices beauty for a new ideology. So instead of being pro-beauty like the fascists were, which, okay, that's like one oppressive political ideology, well, then you have the other end of the spectrum, which is another oppressive political ideology being just completely anti-beauty. And so what's concerning is that we've gone from one form of aesthetic propaganda to another. The anti-beauty movement is effectively the flip side of the same coin, pushing unconventional or deliberately ugly aesthetics for a political statement, rather than allowing beauty to exist outside of the political framework entirely. And just a side note to this, because I kind of thought that this was interesting, but the tension is kind of further complicated how some white nationalist groups like Identity Europa have strategically co-opted aesthetics for their branding. Groups like this use classical imagery to promote whatever they're promoting, and that kind of further entrenches this association of fascism with beauty. And I think that this is something important to point out because the relationship with beauty and politics is very complicated. And all of this being framed by the war on beauty, the belief that beauty needs to proliferate. But I think that this is kind of a specific thing, a part of classical beauty that is important to point out, which is that what we need is not a wholesale rejection of beauty, and neither is it a reactionary return to classical aesthetics, but to the recognition that aesthetics matter. Classical beauty is important in small and big ways, but ultimately beauty shouldn't be about meeting political ends. Rather, it should be about lifting people's hearts to God, to elevate our society, our culture, and the individuals that live in it. So we definitely do need to understand how beauty has been politicized, but ultimately it's about going beyond that and rediscovering beauty's capacity to actually transcend political divisions rather than reinforce them. That beauty is not supposed to be a tool for ideological or political ends. Rather, it is to lift people up. I thank you so much for watching. I will see you in the next video, and please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.